go, oh, we can get through the slides really quickly this way, which is fine. They're really more for background anyway. So, well, thank you to Paula. My name's Janet Zeiss. I'm the Community Resilience Coordinator for the Chester County Department of Emergency Services, which is a really fancy way of saying I work in the same group with the 911 Center. They're our most visible part of what we do. I was hired back in 2011. I grew up in Chester County. How many disasters do we have in this area? This should have been my cushy government job. So if you're hired by government, it happened to have been August 1st, 2011. I had worked there exactly 3 weeks. August of 2011, what was the storm? It started with the word hurricane, which once again, this is why we have New Jersey. This should not have been an impact, but it certainly was. Not Agnes, sure, that was a few years actually before me. So that was actually Hurricane Irene. Remember, Hurricane Irene came. I had literally been in my position for 3 weeks. I had 2 things. I had the phone number of the VOAD coordinator for Southeastern Pennsylvania. Anybody familiar with VOAD? Does that mean anything to anybody? Should mean something to you at least, if you've got the FEMA certification going. VOAD is Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters. And that's very important. These are a lot of your large disaster organizations, many of whom the names are very familiar to you: the American Red Cross, the Salvation Army. Many of them are faith-based, Lutheran disaster response, Southern Baptist Relief, organizations like that. But what's cool about those organizations is that even though they may not agree on blue sky days on things, they've come to points of consensus that during disasters, they're going to work together. So I had a phone number of one person, I had the ability to use Google Sheets, and we made it up from there. So for the past 8 years, I've been trying to develop systems and programs and plans and communities that we sure could have done a better job. Because it's interesting, in August of 2011, week 3, was Hurricane Irene. Anybody know what happened in September of that year? What came next?
Twin Towers.
Not yet. This is 2011.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So you're ahead of it. That actually started to change the disaster world as well. That was one of the really big things that changed the way we look at everything. So followed by Tropical Storm Lee 10 days later. Next year, we already talked about it. The original path for Hurricane Sandy had it coming straight up to Chesapeake, which would have actually, if anyone's familiar with Brandywine Hospital in Chester County, that's where it was headed. That was its initial path. Turned left. Instead, it wreaked havoc in New Jersey. Fast forward to 2014. 2014, I think the last presenter touched on it. Ice storm that impacted Chester County. 85% of homes and businesses were without power for some period of time. You lose power in the beginning, it's kind of fun. Anybody like to camp? So, you're in the dark, you tell stories, you play games. You know, it's a lot of fun. By day 2, not as much fun anymore. By week 2, the world is really different. So, after 2014, I'm happy to report we haven't been doing as much of that. We've been actually much more fortunate, which means other communities have not been. So instead of focusing so much on what is our community responding to and how do we do that, we've been talking about what makes our community more resilient. What's going to make us better positioned knowing that these events are becoming, call it what you want, and so it's, you can do this at the dinner table with anybody who you happen to be sitting with. Talk about events that are becoming more frequent and longer in duration, because that's really how we need to approach this, is more frequent and longer in duration. Looking at the term of resilience, I did a presentation last year at the NIST conference. I actually looked up resilience. We started studying resilience. There were 78 different definitions in the scientific literature, and that was 5 years ago. Every discipline defines resilience a little bit differently, and nobody owns resilience. So the question is what is the federal government doing about resilience? Confusing things, because they're not using the same language. They're all developing toolkits. There are so many of them, it's almost impossible for any community to pick one. So that's where we need to come back to the local community. And we need to talk to local communities about how can we do this? How can we do it for our individuals? How can we do it for our organizations? How can we do this for our communities? Because there are two things that we need to build if we are truly going to be resilient. And that's going to be resilience in the horizontal direction, but also on that vertical path. And we'll talk about those connectors as well. Everybody feel like you're ready to fly? Everybody stand up for a minute, first of all, because you guys have been sitting way too long. You guys can all play the airline stewardess today instead. When you get on the plane, what is the first thing they tell you? They give you the safety lecture, and what do they tell you about that oxygen mask? Don't give it to somebody else until it's only yours. Because if you're not positioned to take care of yourself and your family, no matter how you define that, you're not going to be in a position to help anybody else. Think about that from the individual level. Think about that from the organizational level as well. And that's why you're all here today, I imagine. So you can sit down whenever you're ready. I just figured everybody needed to stretch. So, from the individual level, and no cheating for those of you who came together. We'll see if you even have the same agreement. One being, I might have a bottle of water somewhere in my home. To a score of 5 being 3 months off the grid, not a problem. How many of you are, number 1, you might be able to find a bottle of water. With any luck, it's even a renewable bottle. How many of you guys consider yourselves a 2? I probably have a flashlight. I probably have batteries. They might be in the same place. How many of you are more of a 3? You believe FEMA when they said 72 hours, which is sort of an arbitrary number, but it gives people something to work towards. You have enough food, water, supplies, that if you were completely cut off for whatever reason, for 72 hours, you'd be okay. How many of you guys are in that situation?
2.5.
2.5. She's going to go home and do one more thing today, so maybe she can get to that 3. How about 4s? You're pretty well situated. You have a pretty good idea of how you're going to take care of yourselves. A couple of neighbors come by and think you might take care of them too. You probably have enough supplies to help them. 72 hours is more like a week. You can be self-sufficient. Anybody at 4? And finally, anybody ready to be on their own for the next 3 months? All right, this gentleman who came in last, I would suggest you all meet him at lunch because he's the best positioned, and that's whose house you want to be headed towards. Okay, so from a personal preparedness standpoint, you need to think about yourself and your family. You need to define who your family is. Some of your family members may have 4 legs. Certainly learned that after Katrina. Folks are not going to evacuate unless there's a plan for people as well as their pets. Those are their families, and by choosing not to evacuate during Katrina, the pets were still at risk, the people were at risk, as were the first responders. So that really changed the world and really changed the way we look at disasters. As an organization, and as some of you are meetings, some of you are organizations, some of you are schools, how many of you have an emergency plan? Something happens, someone suddenly suffers a medical emergency, or the building's on fire right now. How many of you have an emergency plan in place? Hands up. Once again, people to talk to at lunch, they're going to become great resources. Okay, so that's one piece, is having an emergency plan. What happens in the moment? How about a business continuity plan? Business continuity plan is, something has happened, how are we going to reopen our doors? How many of you have one of those? Okay, I'm glad you're here. We have work to do this afternoon. How many of you feel like you need one? How many of you recognize the fact that you are part of the disaster system? Paula mentioned it before. The perception is houses of worship are a place you go in time of disaster. These may be folks who you see once a week. These may be folks you see once a year. These may be folks who've lived next door to you for 20 years and have never even asked the question of, gee, I wonder what happens there. But all they know, and Red Cross has done surveys about this, houses of worship are a place to turn for help in disasters. So you can have a plan for it. That would be great. We saw this during the ice storm. There were a few facilities in our county that had a plan and they put it in place to help the general community. We had others who had electricity, coffee, a blackboard, and chalk. And you know what? They took the blackboard, they put it out by the street, they said, we have electricity, come in. Or we have electricity, welcome. And And that's exactly what they did. And then we had others who had regret that, you know, kind of like we were talking about it before. But we had electricity. We could have done something, but we didn't. So there's a couple of places where you're going to fall during a disaster. You're either going to be on the side of personally and as an organization of having resources or needing them. We can all get caught up in the fact that, you know, we always need something, but I'd really rather approach it from an asset-based community development standpoint. What is it that you have? What is it that you can offer? I think every one of you has space, correct? And that's huge. Every one of you has members. You have people. You have volunteers. You have strength in that piece. Every one of you has a spiritual part to this, something else you have to offer. You do a lot of programs on Blue Sky Days. How do those Blue Sky programs translate into something else during that disaster piece? So, takeaway number one, if you take nothing else out of any of this, are you prepared yourself? Because if you're not, you're part of the problem. Second piece of it, as an organization, will your doors reopen? It may not look like it does right now, but in some way, shape, or form, even if it's at an alternate site or in an alternate place, or we're going to do this virtually, how can you exist following a disaster and reopen in some way, shape, or form to create that community? And then pie in the sky is we've thought about ourselves, we've thought about our organizations, what can we do for the greater community as well? All right, who's in charge? And this is coming up really strangely because I PDF'd it because it was much too large. Yes, it is government's responsibility to take care of life and property. At the end of the day, best case scenario, government acting completely efficiently, it's estimated we might be able to do 60%. And that's a might, and that's under perfect conditions. So I won't ask you because I work for government, although I spend most of my time pretending I don't. How many of you think we can do this with 100% efficiency? I can tell you it's much worse than the fossil fuels you were talking about earlier. Okay? So therefore, what's it going to come down to? It's going to come down to the fact of local government, New Jersey's home rule, but that actually makes you function pretty much like Pennsylvania does. In the state of Pennsylvania, okay, first let's back up. We're not a state. We're a commonwealth. Anybody remember back to 8th grade history? The difference is, in a commonwealth, it's the lowest form of government has the authority. Those of you from Philadelphia, this is really simple for you. Philadelphia is the county, and Philadelphia is also the city. It's one. For those of you like me who work in a county, I have 73 municipalities, all of whom operate as independent fiefdoms. What does that mean? It means all emergencies are local, and responsibility ultimately falls to them. This is why in municipalities in Chester County, and Montgomery County, Delaware County, and Bucks County are very similar. You may have one fire department. You may have 4 fire departments who have part of your municipality. You may have state police coverage. You may have regional police coverage. You may have local coverage. It may change every 8 hours, and you know what? They're all okay. Because all that's required is that they have a provision to provide that service. During a disaster, every municipality, as I said, this is Pennsylvania, so New Jersey, you'll have to be a little flexible with me, but they have to have a plan, they have to have a coordinator, and they have to have an emergency operations center, which is for communications. So for me, trying to coordinate things at the county level, there are 3 reasons why we get involved. We get involved because it involves more than one municipality. So that's something like your Hurricane Irene scenario. We get involved if it involves a hazardous material, because your lowest level hazardous material team is at the county level. Or we get invited, or we get involved if we're actually invited. The municipality says, will you help us with your resources, with your connections, with other things? FEMA got a horrible rap after Katrina, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but at the end of the day, the state of Louisiana had responsibility for inviting FEMA, and it took them 3 days to do it. People never heard that. They never understood that. Anymore, now, you know, when Harvey was coming, the good news for Texas is they pre-positioned a tremendous amount of resources. This is something that hadn't happened in Katrina, and that made a huge difference. The good news was, for Harvey, you've got all the resources. Who was that really bad news for? What happened 2 weeks later? Irma came along. Guess where all the resources were? They were in Texas. So they were able to move some of them. Interesting thing about Irma is they actually evacuated people into the area where the storm ultimately hit. So that was a huge challenge, trying to figure out which coast of Florida was going to be impacted. And then moving into Maria. Once again, one of the reasons, I mean, it's also an island that had another set of challenges for it, but one of the reasons why Maria is so difficult to respond to is because there was already such resource fatigue, and all these other disasters were already happening when that came across. So disasters are local. Anybody who's an old movie aficionado and has seen The Blob, that's the ultimate disaster from Chester County. Proving all disasters are local. In Phoenixville, they still have Blob Fest every year. I highly recommend coming out. It's just a cultural experience unto itself. So, kitschy movie of the 1950s, still funny. They reenact it every year. But proving all disasters are local when a community can claim that. None of us can do this alone. These are some of my particular partners. You need to establish who your partners are. And it may be partners on the four corners. We have a great group in Westchester. It was four different churches in Westchester who realized in blue sky days, the days without a disaster, they were all addressing a lot of the same human service needs. And they figured out, you know what, if we worked together, hired a staff person, we could do this much more strategically. Disasters function the same way. We're talking about maybe you can open your doors during a disaster. Maybe that doesn't make sense if you're not the organization that has the generator. But maybe you have folks who can go and help with something else. Maybe you have a parish nurse. Maybe you have something else that you bring to the table. You have volunteers. You have someone with a food handler's license. So it's really a matter of figuring out, what do we want to do? What should we be? What can't we be? And who can we partner with so there aren't gaps as we do this? Phases of disaster. The disaster itself is very short. You know, sometimes it may only last, in the case of a tornado, it may only last minutes, hours, days. So the incident itself is very short. Response, that's the exciting part. That's the lights and the sirens. This is what's captured on television. Recovery. Recovery is what happens next. Recovery really starts when the disaster starts. It's that assessment of needs and that rebuild process that may need to happen. And rebuilding is everything. It's everything from structures to communities. And within communities, it's individuals and lives. Mitigation. We use mitigation a little bit differently than what you've been talking about all morning with the weather piece. Mitigation is building it better so the next time it'll have less of an impact. It's not if the next disaster is going to happen, it's when, but it's build it smarter. It's don't put the HVAC system back in the basement if it flooded. Put it on the first floor. That type of thing. Which brings us back to preparedness, which is where we are today. That's the other side, the emergency management. Fact of the matter is, this is what really happens after a disaster. Okay? Pre-disaster, everything's pretty steady state. We're able to hold symposiums like this on nice sunny days. Then the impact. You hit your low, but it's also where you're on television. If you're going to fundraise around a disaster, you've got about 4 days before your old news. And that really depends on what else is going on in the world as well. Honeymoon phase. Everybody comes together. Everybody wants to help. Everybody's in it for the greater good. But the fact of the matter is it's messy, and it's long, it's exhausting. So, that's where you get to disillusionment. And it takes a long time to build a community back. Been working with some folks at Johns Hopkins on a project called COCO. Their premise is pre-disaster community functioning is the indicator of how well the community will recover. So for right now, it's how can you increase your capabilities and your capacities, knowing that following a disaster, that's your best chance for recovery. Chaos, confusion, and crisis, cooperation, coordination, and communication. This goes back to those VOED principles. This is what needs to happen. Not a good day. Personal experience. Who are going to be the greatest champions for this? A lot of times it's people who've had this experience. Find those folks who are willing to give testimony of what happened, like the folks over here, when your home burned down, how the community responded, what a difference that made even today. Okay, this was the streets of Philadelphia. This is when they had the earthquake. This also happened right when I started. So I don't know if anybody remembers the earthquake in Virginia. We felt it here. Our 911 center started lighting up like a Christmas tree. Philadelphia, they all went out in the streets. Anybody grow up in California? Is this the correct response to an earthquake?
Yeah.
Absolutely not. They're standing there on their phones taking pictures of the buildings that would have fallen on them had this really been an earthquake that impacted Pennsylvania. We do have fault lines. They run through Pennsylvania. But once again, what is your experience? If you grew up in Tornado Alley, you're very conscious of that. I went to school in the Midwest. There were sirens that were going off. It should have told me there was a tornado coming. My question was, why are they testing their nuclear power plant sirens at this time of day? Because here where I grew up, that's what the siren going off meant. So you need to understand your home communities, but those of you who travel, you also need to understand your risk factors in other places. As far as what you should be planning for, water, water, and more water. Might be frozen in the case of the ice storm, might be flooding. Interesting thing about the disasters that crossed Pennsylvania in 2018, 50% of them were not riverine flooding. They were flooding caused mainly by impervious surfaces and changes to the environment. So Schuylkill County, Susquehanna County, and quite a few other ones are actually having active recovery efforts going on to flooding events that don't have a name that significantly impacted communities. Touched on a lot of these already, 2011, 2012, 2014, 2016, 2018. Map in the corner shows you the power loss across the entire county. Top corner was 2011, 2014. Everything from your infrastructure of your communities, your inability to move people or goods, as well as personal impact and power. Unfortunately, somebody touched on this. The reality of shootings in both houses of worship and schools is real. And this truly tells you that no one is immune. If this can happen at West Nickel 9 School in Lancaster County, it can truly happen anywhere. So what are we going to do? You can either increase your resources, and you can limit your vulnerabilities. And that's what we're going to try and balance out. Obviously, no one's ever going to have as many resources as they'd like to have. But really, for me, the definition of a disaster is, do you have the resources available to handle it? What's a disaster for one person is not for someone else. Why? Because when he presented before, after 4 days, what did he do? He was paying attention. Somebody must have been still listening. Took out his credit card and found a hotel room because he had the resources to do that. And the resources aren't always financial. They often help. But often those resources can look like something else. So this is your game. If you're going to decrease risk, you're going to have to work on one of these sides. Ideally, you're working on all of them. So how do we do it? Emergency plan. What happens if something bad were to happen right now? Somebody grasps their chest right now, what are we doing? Those are all good answers, but what's the best answer? Thank you. Because unless you call 911, you're not going to have the right resources here to take care of it. So finding out if there's an AED in this building, critical. But calling 911 means you're actually going to have help that's going to come. Okay? This is continuity plan. This is, will your school or house of worship reopen? If so, at what capacity? At what time frame? That type of piece. After Joplin, everybody remembers Joplin, Missouri, what happened there? After the tornadoes, there are two things folks said they needed to recover in their own communities. One was employment, and the second one was schools. Because the schools provide that safe environment for the kids. It starts to give them structure at a time when pretty much everything in their world is out of control. It's a place where they can get everything from food, as well as care and compassion from their teachers, routine. All critically important for those kids to have some sense of normalcy and be on the road to recovery. Will they be different? Absolutely. How they bounce back is really dependent on what happens at that point. So the schools are critical. Sometimes it's as simple as insurance. How many of you have talked to your insurance adjusters about what does this mean? Are they going to pay to have you have an alternate location? Is that part of your policy? Are you going to be able to keep your staff? We had a terrible nursing home fire in Chester County with 4 fatalities a couple of years ago. The biggest blessing that came out of that is they had business interruption insurance, which allowed them to keep their staff on hand. So when all their other residents were displaced across the county in other facilities, their staff was still able to be part of that care. Their staff was able to be out and visiting. Their staff was able to be part of that process, and their staff is now, for the most part, returned as they're starting their rebuild process. And that was huge. And that really came down to insurance more than anything else, which gave them the resources to do that well. And then start thinking about, are you or should you be somebody's disaster partner? I'm actually going to stop right here because I know I'm over time already. We could talk about any one of these things for a very long time. We're going to talk about some of these things as part of our afternoon sessions, and also